So, Rich, I've got a family vacation next week. I'm going to be out of town. We're going to the beach. Do you have any beach takes? Do you like the beach?
I've got a love-hate relationship with the beach out here in California because the water comes down from Alaska and it also churns from deep from the Pacific Ocean. So it's extremely cold at all times of the year, but it's so pretty that it's hard not to go on nice drives and look at it. But not the best, not as good as the Atlantic Ocean. What about you?
So to me, the beach is like Brian Robinson in best ball drafts. Large and overrated. I'm JJ, and last year I tried my hardest to become a best ball bro. I drafted over 500 teams, I talked to some of the most successful best ball players in existence, and I admittedly had mixed results. So this year, I'm going to chase that title once again. My plan is to max enter DraftKings Millionaire Maker, and I'm going to document all of it while talking to the brightest best ball minds on the planet. Last year, I didn't quite get there, but this year, this is going to be the year where I officially become a best ball bro. This episode is sponsored by DraftKings. There's no better way to lock in your fantasy dominance early than with Best Ball on DraftKings, where you draft once and ride your roster all season long. And right now, DraftKings is giving all customers a can't-miss offer. Draft one, get one. Enter a lineup in the $15 million Best Ball contest for just $20, and you'll score another Best Ball ticket to play free for a share of that $15 million, giving you a second shot to win big. It's easy. Just draft your dream team once, no weekly management required, and let your top scorers automatically start each week. Across the whole season, every breakout star, every clutch play, every touchdown will count towards your quest for a share of $15 million. I'm drafting over there all the time. It's an absolute blast. So download the DraftKings Daily Fantasy app now to draft your $20 best ball lineup to play for a share of $15 million and get a second ticket to play free for a share of that $15 million. That's two chances to win big without ever setting your lineup again. Draft one, get one, only on DraftKings. The crown is yours. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In New York, call 8778-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY to 467-369. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org. 18 plus in most eligible states, but age varies by jurisdiction. Eligibility restrictions apply. Void where prohibited. One per customer. Enter the Best Ball $15 million headliner contest by 9/4/25 to get one bonus entry. $20 entry fee required. Reward expires in 30 days. See terms at DraftKings.com/NFL-best-ball. Sponsored by DK. Now back to the show. Welcome into another episode of Becoming a Best Ball Bro. I'm JJ Zacharyson, joined as always by Rich Ryan. Rich, what's going on, man?
Doing good, man. Your live draft recording this today on Tuesday. So for the folks listening or watching on YouTube at Late Round FF, yesterday was very much West Coast dad approved because it was while I was making breakfast, getting the coffee ready. I could fire on 1.5X while I was getting some stuff done. So love that time. Hope you stick with it.
Yeah, look, a lot of people commented about that. I did the show at 10 a.m. Eastern, and some people were commenting like, you know, after the show was over, being like, man, you were up early this morning. I'm like, guys, I got two kids. One of them's not seven yet. She turns 7 at the end of July. The other one's 2.5. You think that I'm waking up at 9 a.m. every morning? I mean, I am up at 6 a.m. every day because those kids make me get up at 6 a.m. every day. Summertime's been a little bit nicer. It's a little bit closer to 7 because, you know, they'll go to bed a little bit later because we're out, you know, doing summertime things, you know. But yeah, man, I did it at 10 a.m. It was an easy time for me to do it. And if people are into that, I can do it at 10 a.m. more often. I didn't even think about the fact that I was reaching the West Coast demographic the way that I was reaching them.
Yeah, honestly, it was the perfect way to start the day. I'm usually doing those chores, listening to some kind of podcast, but today I got to replace it with some info, some knowledge, and you had a query on that live stream that we're going to be able to dig into here.
Yeah, let's do that. You know, I've been drafting, I think I'm only at like 26 or 27 milli makers at this point, and I'm trying to max it at 150. So a little bit behind, you know, David Kitchen, who works for Late Round Fantasy Football. Shout out Kitchen, who is the COO. He's in the 40s, so he's like 20 ahead of me right now. He's doing well, you know, with keeping pace. I'm not. I need to basically do like 2 a day at this point to feel really good, but it's going to be more than 2 a day because I like to do it live and not slow drafts, with these things because, for all the reasons that we've talked about before. But on that live stream, I mentioned something that I want to talk about and that we'll talk about today. You brought some ADP data, and I want to see if my sort of intuition lines up with what the ADP data says. And that intuition is, it feels like a lot of these later round quarterbacks right now, they're moving up in ADP. And I'm not talking about like the Bo Nixes or Brock Purdy's or Dak Prescott's even of the world. I mean, I think Dak, you can maybe argue, but I'm speaking more to the fact that it seemed like in May when I was doing these drafts, I could wait a really long time at times and still get Bryce Young at a reasonable cost, or still get, obviously Aaron Rodgers hadn't signed anywhere yet. And we didn't know that we had an idea that he was going to be a Steeler, but we didn't know for sure that he was going to be a Steeler. And it felt like you could get those kinds of players like towards the tail end of your draft. But now you're getting them in round 12, round 13. And all of the quarterbacks are like dried up and done, starting quarterbacks, by the time you get to the end of round 14, which leaves 6 rounds of your draft with really not a whole lot of quarterback selections. And so I had this discussion on the live stream where, my particular build, which by the way, if you guys want to see a build that I personally like and prefer, I would check out that stream as the most recent one. So that would have been on June 24th. But, I had a 3 quarterback build. I got Caleb Williams because I drafted Roma Dunze. And then I drafted, Matthew Golden. So I ended up going with Jordan Love. And then I got Brock Bowers early, and I had a Malik Neighbors and Tyrone Tracy bring back, and I got Geno Smith. So I had all 3 quarterbacks were stacked, which is great. But then you look back at the draft board and you see, I'm getting Geno Smith because of the way that people push quarterbacks. And we know that DraftKings can be the Wild West in a good way, in a fun way, right? In the way that people will just take unstacked quarterbacks and uncorrelated quarterbacks. And so you feel this need to get these quarterbacks maybe a round ahead of ADP. And I think that's also driving these quarterback prices up a little bit. So I'll ask you, are we seeing this in the market? Are quarterback ADPs, these lower end quarterbacks, are they shooting up a little bit? And I say a little bit because obviously when we look at averages, we're not expecting like 2 rounds worth of ADP when we're looking at averages across a pretty, long time period. But are these ADPs for these quarterbacks, are they actually shifting?
Right now, 10 quarterbacks since we started doing this show have moved up. 2 of them for more obvious reasons. Aaron Rodgers, the most obvious. He's up 30.8 spots because he signed officially with your Pittsburgh Steelers. Then Daniel Jones is actually the largest mover at 31.8 spots, and that's because of the drumbeat that we are getting out of Indianapolis, that he is likely to be the starter there. And then you've got 8 quarterbacks who don't have very much major news attached to them, but they are up. McCarthy up 10 spots, Shuck up 8.6, Prescott 7, Penix 6, Drake May, Bryce Young, Brock Purdy, Justin Fields, all up 5, 3, and 2. So you're right in a general sentiment that things are starting to creep up. And we know, it being June, that the influx of casual drafters is not here yet, right? This is the quietest time in the 12-month NFL calendar where there is nonstop news all of the time. This is going to be the quietest time of the year, and it's going to be quite quiet for drafters. So I can only see this increasing the more influx of casual drafters that we get.
Yeah, and the problem too, so going back to let's look at Dak, for instance, and you can go back and have a companion while we're talking about this by looking at the draft board that I did on the 24th, during that 10 a.m. live stream. But, Dak Prescott goes in round 10, right? And then I get Jordan Love, I think it was a round and a half later than Dak, and then Geno Smith pretty close to that, just because I needed to get Geno. And so the thing is, though, is that the opportunity, I don't even think Jordan Love is the example. I think Geno is the example. So let's just say Geno goes a round and a half, 2 rounds after Dak Prescott. I mean, it might have been bigger, it might have been smaller, but let's just run with this hypothetical. The opportunity cost, when you actually look at the players that are being drafted in between those 2 quarterbacks, to me, it's not that significant. And that's the problem in waiting for that type of quarterback in general, right? Where if you look at the opportunity cost, so the opportunity cost, the types of running backs that you're drafting Dak Prescott over in those rounds, Ramondre Stevenson, Javonte Williams, they're the kind of players, and wide receivers there too. They're the kind of players that you almost feel forced to take because you don't need a quarterback, right? Like you're just like, well, I don't know who to pick. I don't have anyone else to go with. So sure, I'll take Ramondre Stevenson, even though they just drafted an early round 2 running back who's going to steal a lot of pass catching work from him, right? Or I'm going to get Javonte Williams, who hasn't been efficient since his major knee injury. And sure, he might be the lead back for Dallas, but I don't think anyone feels overly confident about Javonte Williams in fantasy football this year. I'm not saying I'm fading him, but it's not like you're going to be aggressively targeting Javonte Williams at this moment, right? And so even though I do think that some people in the fantasy industry have taken the Javonte stuff a little bit too far, I will say that. But you look at that, and then you look at the other tier of running backs that I talked to Tyler about in particular last week, and I think that we both really agreed that there are some 0 RB targets on DraftKings that just go way too late. And I'm talking the kinds of players I'm talking about here. I've talked about Austin Eckler already, plenty on the show. You know, I think that Eckler's ADP is driven down by, sure, Brian Robinson, sure, it's a mobile quarterback. And I do think Deebo Samuel is probably playing somewhat of a role with this, but I still think his ADP is way too low, Austin Eckler's. But like Rachaad White, why does Rachaad White go where he goes in drafts? I cannot understand why a guy who wasn't even that bad with Bucky Irving last year, okay, from a points per game perspective, he's a pass catcher. He could be their negative game script back if and when those negative game scripts hit. And he has contingent upside. If Bucky Irving gets hurt, then Rachaad White sees a ton of... We've seen Rachaad White be a low-end RB1 in fantasy football before, and this is a really good offensive environment for him to hypothetically thrive in, right? So you get Rachaad White, Jalen Wright, I think is a really interesting 0 RB target. Like, to me, if I'm thinking about ceiling outcomes, I don't think there's that big of a difference in ceiling outcome between Ramondre Stevenson and, Rachaad White. Or I would argue that Rachaad White has a bigger ceiling outcome than Ramondre Stevenson. Or Rico Dowdle, who we talked about on the show last week, as someone who, if you're not drafting as much Chuba, which I'm not drafting as much Chuba for reasons I've discussed on, the late round fantasy football show, which is also on YouTube. I'm afraid of that previous season yards per route run and the fact that they get 2 pass catching backs over the offseason that could steal some of that work. Rico Dowdle's that dude. And if, again, there's contingent upside, like if Chuba Hubbard gets hurt, Rico Dowdle would be the 1A in that backfield more than likely, right? And so the problem in drafting and waiting those and trying to squeeze out value in those couple of rounds from a guy like Dak and even Purdy when he falls, the problem is that there aren't many good players that you're drafting anyways, right? The major issue that I run into is I only want to draft quarterbacks where I'm generally stacking. And what this has done, and I know that we're kind of getting deep here and in the weeds, and it might be tough to follow.
This is the good stuff. No, this is the good stuff.
What this has done for me is it's forced me to take a lot of naked quarterbacks to stack then late, because I just want to get a quarterback who I know is going to be a good value and then hope to get some pieces later. So it's harder to do that with like a Dak Prescott, but it's easier to do that with a Trevor Lawrence, right? You can get De'Ami Brown and Brenton Strange. You can do it with Jordan Love really easily, right? With Romeo Doubs, even Dontavian Wicks if you really want to. But you can still try to get like a Matthew Golden and set that up when you see your draft going a certain direction, early on if you're not getting a lot of that correlation, right? I'm not saying, like, at the end of the day, like, a lot of the pocket passers, and I've written about this, I've talked about this, a lot of the pocket passers can match the production of the earlier round pocket passers. It's why I don't think in season long, especially, Jared Goff is a very good pick at all, because Jared Goff's production there's arbitrage to that production, right? You can, like, I know it sounds crazy, but I'm not going to be surprised if like Geno Smith outscores Jared Goff this year. Like, do I think it's probable? No, but there's at least this outcome if touchdown rates go a certain way, if teams start scoring more rushing touchdowns and passing touchdowns in a sort of abnormal way, then you can see a scenario where Geno Smith just outscores, Jared Goff. So I don't want to like downplay that idea, because I do think that's really, really important. But at the same time, a player like Dak Prescott, a player like Caleb Williams even, right? Like, these guys are seemingly stagnant for the most part, like not shifting as much as some of the guys shifting like later than them. And that's creating a better value for those players. And then it's also going back to what we had talked about with like Neil Orfield, a couple episodes ago. It's creating the early round quarterbacks becoming a little bit more valuable too, because if every quarterback gets drafted earlier, then the early round quarterbacks, if they stay with the exact same ADP, then they're more attractive, right? Because if you're getting Josh Allen in the 4th round, he's fallen to the 4th plenty in drafts that I've done. If you get Josh Allen in the early 4th round, and then all of a sudden, Baker Mayfield goes in the 7th, and, Bo Nix and stuff are going in the late 7th, that's huge for the Josh Allen drafter, And so that's where my head's been at a lot with these drafts, is that I'm trying to recognize the flow of the quarterback position, and that's changing the way that I'm drafting the position if I can get those later stacks.
That is what's so interesting about where the market is shifting, because it's the middle class that is shifting up, and the top end, Josh Allen is down 5.7 spots. Lamar Jackson down 3.4 spots. Jaden Daniels down 4.3 spots. So that part of my brain it's really tough to click on a lot of these middle class quarterbacks, because you're spending up for an asset that is not as valuable as the ones that have just been drafted, right? Mm-hmm. And it's really a tough buy to make. But on the flip side, you're going to find yourself in these situations where one of the things you've talked about repeatedly at these onesie positions, quarterback and tight end, especially when it comes to value, is that if you're the first to take a player in a tier in one of these onesie positions, you damn well better hope that the players after you are also taking these players. Yeah. And I think that's holding true at the quarterback position on DraftKings right now. So that bit of fear that, am I really going to take this quarterback and be out on a limb when 8 or 9 running backs and receivers go next? I don't think so. From what I'm seeing anecdotally, I think we can comfortably start new tiers on quarterback, and we'll see quarterbacks go off the board after.
Yeah, I think part of the problem too is that, I personally am really enjoying the more unpredictable nature of DraftKings Best Ball, because it creates a lot of value for your team. You can have a really strong build. Like if you get a really strong build with a lot of correlation, you're standing out against the competition a lot more on DraftKings, because there's people on DraftKings that are, entering they're like, oh, what's Best Ball? I'm going to try out Best Ball. And they don't have any idea what stacking is, what week 17 correlation is, anything like that, or optimal, roster builds. And on one side, it's really frustrating because, you'll get, I drafted Jamar Chase and T. Higgins the other day and Trey McBride, and someone took naked Joe Burrow in the middle of the 3rd round. And you're like, what, why, why is this happening? It's really frustrating on that end, but you can sort of flip that on its head. And that's why, look at this show, Rich. Like, we haven't complained about that at all this offseason.
No, last year, I feel like we were tilting way more last year. Whereas, and this is a trope that comes from poker, is a lot of people will complain when they're playing against weaker competition. Oh, the big thing is, I'm going to move up to a stake where people are going to respect my raise. And it's like, no, you actually want to be playing against people who are not going to respect your raise and hand you equity. And yes, in the short term, you're going to get your butt kicked sometimes. Sometimes people are going to take unstacked Joe Burrow, and it's going to make you very angry. But when your competition is making these mistakes at such a high frequency, that's when we can take advantage and build better teams.
Yeah, I think it just comes down to like the live stream. Again, going back to that, I had very little correlation through like 8 rounds of that stream. And I think a lot of people will feel, if you're consuming this podcast, if you're consuming best ball content, you're ahead of the curve in general, especially on DK, in terms of like your knowledge about best ball, right? So you're probably thinking through round 8, if you have no correlation, I'm screwed. Because there's no correlation, you feel really unbalanced and it feels tougher to land the plane, if you will. But it's really not that difficult. It's not nearly as difficult as you think, especially with the extra rounds too. And so I think that's really just where my mindset has shifted a lot drafting on DraftKings, is just knowing that it's not over when you don't have that early correlation. And it's okay. Like, describing the quarterbacks as just like middle round quarterbacks doesn't do it enough justice, because there's a lot of pockets, right? Like, there are times where Dak and Justin Herbert and, like a Jordan Love type or whomever, they'll fall. And that's where I'm trying to attack and get those players when they do fall. I'm speaking more to the idea that when those players start to come off the board, you can't push it.
The avalanche is coming. The famous receiver avalanche that we talked about last year.
Yeah.
There is a end of round 9, beginning of round 10, quarterback avalanche, and you better get out ahead of it.
Right. You can't. It's one of those things like you don't want to be at the end of a run, right? Because then you're just devaluing that player. But at the same time, it dries up. It runs out. You can get screwed if you don't, react to that run happening. And it's harder to do that when you're at the turn. And so you do have to push it a little bit. Not push it, actually do the opposite, because pushing would mean that you push guys later in the draft. You have to attack it more aggressively than you otherwise think that you should, right? Like even the draft today, dude, like I had Rome Odunze and I wanted Caleb Williams. That was in the 11 spot. Usually in the 11 spot when the team had Jaden Daniels next to me, right? All day in a rational, logical world, I would not draft Caleb Williams and wait until it comes back around because it's only 2 more picks. And I'd get the running back or wide receiver that I liked more and then just get Caleb Williams in the next round because they got Jaden Daniels. You can't do that. And that, at the end of the day, is why these ADPs, I think, are rising because there's a lot of panic. But the panic, in my opinion, is justified at the end of the day.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, so this hits on multiple things that we've discussed. This is also one of the reasons why I think it's so valuable to be doing these fast drafts because you can pay attention and make your decisions based on what's actually happening as opposed to just opening up your lineup and trying to refigure out what you're doing and what round it is and recalibrate.
Yeah, it's a good point. So today's guest, I did talk about the quarterback position with him. It's Mike Leone, a good friend of mine from Establish the Run. He's been a successful best ball player in the past. I was going to say DFS player, but he's also been a very successful DFS player. He's done a ton of research in best ball, probably more research than like almost any other human on the planet with best ball stuff. So obviously has a ton of knowledge he brings to the table. We talked about the quarterback position and he talked about really liking those middle round, more like boring kind of pocket passer types because he, feels that he would be able to match, with 3 of them and with that extra round of DraftKings, match some of the earlier round quarterback stuff. So it's an interesting conversation that will tie in really well with what we just discussed. But we talk about DraftKings being a full PPR format. Again, the quarterback landscape, elite tight end. He has some interesting elite tight end takes. So much more. Super sharp guy, super awesome guy. So without further ado, here is my interview with Mike Leone. All right, Leone, with DraftKings being a PPR platform, I got to ask you, how does that shift the way that you draft? I know you've done so much research on best ball. I think you might have, like from an analytical perspective, there are a few people I think on planet Earth who have done more, work within best ball than you have. So I should preface all of this with that. But with DraftKings being full PPR, how does that shift your draft strategy?
Yeah, I mean, the pass catchers are boosted up earlier. I'm going to draft wide receiver heavier earlier because the gap between the top wide receivers and, the scores you can cobble together in the later rounds is going to grow. I think that's pretty intuitive, but sometimes people are still reaching too much for running backs. And when talking about running backs, you do want to consider the range of outcomes on some of these non-pass catching backs. Like obviously if you have a situation like last year where Saquon, Derrick Henry, like they really hit their ceiling, it's not going to matter. But I do think you want to consider like the 75th percentile outcomes for some of these guys where they have a pretty good season, but they're just not catching a lot of balls and they're really getting past at a point in the draft where there's a ton of opportunity cost. Someone like Jonathan Taylor, we're about a half round behind on ADP on DraftKings, and the pass catching is a big reason why. Really needs to have a superior rushing efficiency season, which can happen. It happened last year on a couple guys that we were too low on and it burned us. But at the end of the day, when you're looking at the bets you're making, the total range of outcomes, you got to factor that in. So be careful with, especially in the first 3 to 4 rounds, getting those backs that really don't have much of a pass catching profile. And then I think there's some notes on tight end, but I want to save that for talking about elite tight ends later.
Yeah, cool. I do want to ask you if, should drafters be assuming that the flex spot is being filled with wide receiver? I don't want to think too binary, of course, because obviously you could hit on a mid-round running back or late-round running back, and then that guy is just going to be, you have 3 really solid running backs each week. But when you're going into a draft, are you sort of intuitively thinking like this is a start maybe not 4 wide receiver, but like 3.8 wide receiver or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the old school, you want to win the flex, right? So absolutely, I'm going into a draft considering receiver much more on a half PPR best ball site is more likely to fill my flex. And the bonuses play a factor into this too. Obviously, like the very elite rushers up top can get that 100-yard rushing bonus, but I think you're going to see a little bit more from the receiving game. And again, just that gap grows between the elite wide receivers and the non-elites. And I guess like as we're talking about this too, that funnels to the quarterback position where there's some weird intricacies where I feel like the things that make sense on DraftKings, the market does like opposite, and they do them like more on like some of the half PPR sites.
Yeah.
One of them would be the running backs go earlier on DraftKings than some other sites, even though they get hurt by the PPR scoring. The other would be the elite quarterbacks sometimes go like pretty early on DraftKings. And as we're talking through it, like even the pass catching running backs, like the skill players that get a lot of volume, whether they're running backs, wide receivers, or tight ends, the gap between them and the inferior players later in the draft is just growing. Whereas the draft between the quarterbacks early in the draft and later in the draft is about the same as it is on a half PPR site. Yet some of these elite quarterbacks go even earlier on DraftKings. So it's tougher for me to draft an elite quarterback on DraftKings.
Do you think that part of that, and this goes into the next question I want to ask you, do you think that part of it with DK's quarterback ADP and quarterback landscape has to do with the fact that more teams are going to be willing to go with 3 quarterback? Now, there's been plenty of research. I don't know how much you've done around this. I'm sure plenty as well. But I know that the conversation, especially this offseason on Twitter and on social media, has been to go 3 quarterback as opposed to going 2 quarterback, or at least more people are kind of forcing that. And then with DraftKings having 2 additional rounds and it being a 20-round draft, that probably forces people to say to themselves, hey, I'm going to get 3 quarterbacks in this draft. I know I'm going to get 3 quarterbacks in this draft. And so that naturally just like pushes some of these guys upwards a little bit. Do you think that's happening? And then do you advocate for that 3 quarterback strategy? And then one more question on top of that. How are you sort of altering your strategy with there being those 2 additional rounds?
Yeah. So I'm not totally convinced that people drafting more quarterbacks is driving up the elite quarterback ADP. Just looking at our ranks relative to ADP, we're pretty behind on the elite quarterbacks, but we're like ahead of ADP on a lot of the mid-tier quarterbacks. And I think that scarcity would drive everybody up if that's what was causing it. Yeah. It's possible, we're just very off market in terms of where we think the quarterbacks should go. As far as drafting 3 quarterbacks, I think with the 20-round drafts, 3 quarterbacks, 3 tight ends should be like your default. And I think even with taking an elite quarterback or an elite tight end, there's room to take a third, and it's kind of an unnecessary risk not to. Maybe be a little bit more prone to only taking 2 quarterbacks because you don't want to take a really shaky third if you got an elite quarterback and like kind of waste the spot late. But you can still pull off the elite quarterback strategy and not devote a ton of that doesn't mean you're taking 2 other mid-tier quarterbacks with your elite quarterback. You're still going to wait and not devote a ton of capital, just like is kind of the idea behind a 2 quarterback strategy. You don't have to devote as much capital. You can devote roster spots. You can still convert one of those late roster spots to a third quarterback and play it a little bit safer. So I think that's the default a little bit. I think that answered the first 2 of your 3 questions, and I forgot what the third was.
Threw a lot your way. No, it's just basically like, it seems like the additional rounds for you are telling you that you should get 3 quarterbacks, you should get 3 tight ends. Are there any other like things that change mentally for you and strategically with those 2 additional rounds?
There's a couple things. I think there's some opportunity at the onesie positions, particularly tight end, to go to 4. Some people, even on some of the 18-round sites have found 4 tight ends to be a little bit more viable than one would consider. I think that's a stretch. But when you get to these 20-round drafts, I really think that that's a strategy that you can look at if you're drafting 4 tight ends late. A lot of times where the tight ends go, they are safer bets than the running backs and wide receivers, especially at this point in the offseason where we don't really know the roles of some of those later round running backs and wide receivers, whereas the tight ends, we kind of know they're starting players. Yeah. And it's not like they can't contribute in your flex position. So I think taking 4 and like kind of with the randomness of the position and also the injury rates of the position, can make sense. You're not going to do that now if you take, a McBride early, you're only going to stick to 3 in that scenario, or you could do 2. But as I said, I still like going to 3. So that's one thing I'll do. Something that I wouldn't do in an 18-round draft that you could do in 20-round draft that's very specific. But if you wanted to take like Daniel Jones and Anthony Richardson super late, I think you can maybe justify it a bit more with the 20-round draft, especially those rounds 19 to 20 picks, like very unlikely to come through if you want to just get a stranglehold on the quarterback position for the Colts, in which one of those guys can be undervalued, certainly on a per game basis. I think both those guys are going to, when they start, are going to produce at a higher level than their QB positional ADP. We don't know who's going to start. And a final one that I'd consider doing with more drafts, a little bit more room to gamble just on pure upside late, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes I'm really worried about like dead roster spots, taking players that, they sound good in June, July when we're drafting, but then, the odds of them making the roster are a little bit lower, and you enter the season with a dead roster spot, and those kind of add up as injuries and whatnot happen over the course of the season. When you have 20 rounds, even if you are devoting extra resources to quarterback and tight end, I do think there's some wiggle room to take some home run swings there later with your skill players.
Yeah, makes sense. When you look at how best ball drafters typically draft, I asked this to Tyler, Emo Cowboy, last week on the show. When you look at how best ball drafters just traditionally draft, what's one thing that you think that drafters are doing sort of incorrectly overall?
Yeah, so I have 2 answers. I have like one for I guess maybe more beginner casuals and one for more advanced players. For beginners casuals, I think just they have a tough time balancing the draft capital correctly. And when I say draft capital, what I'm talking about is like if you take Saquon Barkley early, each pick has a lot of draft capital. That's a lot of draft capital you're already devoting to the running back position. So now you don't want to go overboard on running back throughout the draft. You have to assume that Saquon Barkley, especially in these big tournaments, is going to have a very good season and is going to stay relatively healthy. The truth is, even if you just look at, let's say in the big tournament, even if you just focused on the regular season aspect, weeks 1 through 14 and advancing out of that, it's 2 out of 12 teams. It's top heavy. If Saquon Barkley gets hurt, you're probably going to lose, and you just need to accept that. You don't want to be drafting too heavy on running back. You get to a point of diminishing returns where Saquon's score is counting for you like every week if he stays healthy. And that could be, those resources could be devoted elsewhere. So just kind of balancing how much draft capital you're allocating to each of the positions. For advanced players, I think sometimes advanced players can be a little bit more inflexible. Like they can get really take locked on their player takes and want to have super heavy exposures. I still think even if you're good at that, and I think having player takes is important, ADP value is still important. So you want to find a good middle ground there. And same thing with roster construction stuff. I think people who typically know what the best roster constructions are might go into a draft and be overly focused and rigid on kind of checking these boxes that they feel like they have to do to be optimal, when some of the fun in drafting and some of the best upside unique builds you can get is by kind of taking what the draft gives you and being flexible in terms of making that work around it.
Yeah, I think that point is really important, the last one that you made about how when you go into a draft, it's almost like you think about, especially if you're like max entering the millie or something like that, and you're going to have hundreds of lineups that you're drafting over the summer. Even if you have 50 plus, you don't even have to be super high volume. I do think that it's very easy to enter a draft and think to yourself, I have to be as optimal as possible in this singular draft, and I have to get my favorite values. And if I don't get but you really have to just be more open-minded. I've realized, because last year, for instance, I was way too rigid with my overall roster construction, and that can just that strategic angle, because then that you're going to be more heavily exposed to certain players and less exposed to other players. Just having that that take lock, if you will, on roster construction can really ruin you. So I think that's where I've really enjoyed this goes back to the previous question, the extra 2 rounds, is that you can kind of get funkier with the way that you're organizing your team. And in my opinion, DraftKings, the lobbies and the drafters are just more wild west than you're going to get, on other platforms, which, can be frustrating at times. Like yesterday or the other day, I had a Jamar Chase and T Higgins stack, and someone inexplicably drafted Joe Burrow in the middle of the third round. Why? I have no idea, but it happened. And so, it's frustrating from that angle. But then the other angle is you can get ADP value. You can really put together some really unique and fun builds because people are a little bit more wild with the ADP. So I think that's a really, really good point to make, is that, don't be overly structured. Like I keep having these conversations with people, and like we're telling you about like how to be optimal and how to think optimally. But part of that to me is like going back to just the season long basics of like being reactive to your draft. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's like, people come and be like, 3-6-8-3 is optimal. Like I got to get a 3-6-8-3. It's like, well, that's like kind of based on the average draft over lots of drafts, with stuff falling. But in this draft, maybe a couple awesome running back values fell to you early.
Yep.
You don't want that to be, maybe a 3-6. Maybe you only want to go 5 running backs because you got like 2 really good early values. What the optimal roster construction is going to change based on what's available to you. It's not something that's like preset in stone that's going to hold throughout the whole draft.
Yeah, 100%. Can you talk about week 17 a bit? This has been a question that a lot of folks have come to me about. I think that intuitively people understand that it makes sense because, it's the final week of the season, and, in these tournament environments, we want the most upside. But you've done a lot of work also on week 15 and 16, not just week 17. So just kind of talk about it. Talk about these playoff weeks and the importance of them and how much you weigh them, and if you think you weigh them more or less than other drafters do.
Yeah, it's a pretty nuanced conversation because like I think there's people that like maybe go overboard with week 17 with the idea being like, okay, that's where the money is. That's what we got to play for. We got to optimize for week 17 because we're trying to win first place. But I think the point that misses is we're building our teams now, not in week 17, and your expected value and your odds of winning are impacted by your odds of advancing, the first weeks 1 through 14 and weeks 15 and week 16 as well. So I push back a little bit on like that's where the money is. So that's where you have to build for. I think that's not totally correct, but at the same time, if you look at the Million Maker on DraftKings, I believe it's about a little over 1,000 people in that final. If you're going to beat that many people, you probably want some correlation in your lineup. Yeah. And not only in week 17, but I think about it in terms of making sure you stack your team in general, having multiple stacks to get you through 3 kind of weeks that are non-continuous. You're starting over. You advance out of the regular season. You got to win week 15. Then you got to win week 16. Then you got to win week 17. And one way to do that is to have multiple quarterbacks stacked, where maybe one stack hits in week 15, different stack hits in week 16, and then you can kind of ping pong that in week 17. Maybe helps you get some unique combinations through to that final week. But as far as completing a game stack, which I consider to be at least one same team pass catcher stacked with your quarterback and one opponent coming back, the data I've seen, which has been more geared to like half PPR sites because DraftKings hasn't, released the full data, though I think this year they may be. That shows if you have 3 quarterbacks game stacked, like the odds of winning a finals, can increase as much as like 20% over average. If you don't have any of your quarterbacks stacked, your odds of winning the finals is going to be below average. And then 1 quarterback stacked is kind of like neutral, and 2 is very good as well in terms of game stacks on a specific week. So it is important that correlation does matter. It just kind of, you don't want to go overboard with it. And you brought up weeks 15 and 16. That's important to stack for too, but it's not as much fun to think about. So it gets overlooked. So if everyone's trying to complete these week 17 game stacks, which, the DraftKings tournament's big enough. I don't know if you have to overly worry about like the combined ownership rates, but maybe a little bit. Mm-hmm. But people aren't doing it for weeks 15 and 16. So maybe your bang for your buck is actually better game stacking there where people aren't doing it and you're getting these correlations that the field isn't going to have. The reason why it's a little bit less important is because you're advancing 1 out of 12 in weeks 15 and 16, as opposed to trying to win 1,000 person field.
Right.
So I talked a lot there about it. But one final note, I will say like always completing an additional team stack is more important than completing a game stack. Like if I've got CJ Stroud stacked and I've got Trevor Lawrence unstacked, it's more important for me to draft a pass catcher with Trevor Lawrence to complete that stack than it is to get an opponent of CJ Stroud's in week 17, because those team stacks are going to help you advance in the regular season, weeks 15, week 16, and week 17.
Yeah. And speaking of those team stacks, I remember years ago when you first did your first like big study on stacking, because we were texting about it and stuff, and I had used and referenced it on a mailbag episode. And one of the things that you brought up in that, because it was more, it was actually like sort of season long focused and stuff too. I remember like it wasn't only like a best ball focused thing. I think it was just season long. But one of the notes that you made in that study and in that research was that, and I try to apply this when speaking about this in best ball too. But when people are stacking, especially in best ball, they think about the weekly upside only, right? But there's also the season long upside, where if you hit on the stack, that ends up just the offense in general ends up outperforming expectation by a whole lot, then your team is going to outperform expectation generally. You know, you'll have better odds to outperform expectation. So like going back to your Houston example, if you have CJ Stroud, Nico Collins, and Jaden Higgins, let's say, and you get them all at ADP, but you know, obviously you're going to get, you know, weekly spikes whenever, you know, Nico Collins has 2 touchdowns and CJ Stroud throws 4 and the other 2 are to Jaden Higgins, let's say. You know, in a perfect world for your team, you get that weekly spike. But what if Houston is the team that ends up outperforming expectation on a touchdowns per game rate by a whole lot? Then all of a sudden you're going to get that more frequently. And then if you get that more frequently, then you're going to outpace, you know, expectation in the way that, you know, other teams are performing as well. I think that's something that often goes sort of untalked about with stacking in general.
Yeah, and to expand on that, I think sometimes people think about only the upside component of why we correlate, but there's also an odds of getting things right in terms of why we correlate. You do what you just said with Houston, you have to get one thing right, and you've gotten 3 spots that have paid off on ADP, as opposed to like, if you have a lot of hubris and you're like, well, no, this is the best receiver to take in this round. This is the best quarterback to take in this round. And like, you know, yeah, I've got Stroud, but I like, you know, this other rookie receiver better than Higgins. You're fighting an uphill battle. You've got to get 3 things right now, whereas I might only have to get 1 thing right to have it pay off. And you have to think through each draft. Again, and what you were saying too is like, if you're building a portfolio of drafts, you got to treat each draft like individually. That doesn't mean you have to bet on Houston in all your drafts, but in this draft, that's the bet you've made, and you do want to lean into that.
Yeah. All right. Let's keep talking about stacking. I want to ask you 2 questions into one, because I'm making things more and more complicated for you throughout today's show. With stacking, should you, number 1, include running backs in those stacks? But then number 2, there's been a lot of chatter over the last couple of years, and I know that ETR has done some research and some work on this, but stacking backfields. So let's say getting Bayshal Tutin and Travis Etienne, as opposed to just, you know, placing a bet on one of those players in a particular draft. So are you, when you're stacking, should people be leaning into running back as well in those stacks? And then the second point and the second question is, what about getting multiple backs when they're cheaper out of those backfields?
First off, what we just said about the seasonal correlation with the team really applies to the running back position as well. If the offense rolls, everybody rolls. So yeah, I think from an advance rate perspective, you want to include running backs in your stack, because again, you're just betting on that offense. I was just talking to Thorman over at ETR about something this morning, and he's looking at the TDs over expected leaders. Jahmyr Gibbs, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jamison Williams, all in the top 20, you know, because the Lions, you know, went nuts. So keep that in mind. I also think sometimes for the weekly upside component, people want to avoid stacking running backs with the quarterback, because kind of the mindset's very narrow of like, this is a passing script or this is a rushing script. And there's some truth to that, certainly. You know, it is definitely less valuable from a weekly upside component. But as someone who's like messed around with DFS sims and has played a lot of DFS over the years, you'd be amazed how many weeks are decided by like one team just really outperforming all the other teams and the running back being included in there in a build that you would think, oh, I can't build that because we're like so narrow-minded thinking, you know, Jared Goff throws this game, so it's got to be Sam Laporte and Amon-Ra St. Brown. I can't have David Montgomery in here. And then Dave, you know, they score 45 points. And so I think that part's overblown. I do want to say, as much as we're hyping up stacking, point that Justin Herzig made on DraftKings, it's maybe a touch less important than other sites because you get the full PPR scoring and you get those 100-yard bonuses. Some of these volume driven up kind of stats sort of diminish the stacking because the touchdown components, Stroud throwing a touchdown to Nico Collins.
Yeah.
And then both getting those touchdown points a little bit diminished when, Puka can go, 10 for 100 and a game the Rams stink. A little bit less important.
Yeah, a little bit. Right.
Just a little bit. But as far as taking running backs together, I want to look at this closer. I looked at this really closely for a single year a few years ago, and it was kind of interesting to look at. And what I had found was these running backs that were a little bit cheaper, think a running back with around 4 to 6 tag and a running back with maybe around 8 to 13 tag, where they kind of had distinct roles in the offense. Maybe one was the 2-down rusher with touchdown upside. The other guy was kind of the pass catching upside. Pairing those together worked pretty well, where you're kind of ping-ponging weeks based on how the game script goes for the team. And then they each do have this kind of contingency upside if the other one gets hurt. But it's got to be pretty clear, what the roles are and that there's not a third annoying back that's going to come in because, part of that bet is if running back B gets hurt, running back A, has this upside that you want to have. It seemed to matter, handcuffing seemed to matter a little bit less in the orthodox handcuff situations. That would be kind of taking Saquon Barkley first overall and maybe, Will Shipley. Because you're if Barkley gets hurt, I got to take Will Shipley. With the 20 rounder, there's a little bit more room for that. Again, you can get more creative, but I don't go out of my way to do that. Now, the ambiguous backfields, which is what you asked about with Jacksonville, the advance rates and whatnot weren't great in terms of pairing those backs together. Again, small sample, I want to look at it again. But those backfields generally had one guy who had a really good advance rate.
Right.
So they're just good backfields to target.
Right.
And again, your bet in a draft doesn't have to be your bet everywhere. If Tuden falls and I take him, I don't know if I want to pair him with ETN. I might just want to make my bet on Tuden in this draft. But another draft, I might make that bet on just ETN.
Right.
So over your portfolio, I think it makes a ton of sense to be investing in these ambiguous backfields, especially if you think, Tank Bigsby's out and it's going to be one of these two guys.
Right.
But within a single draft, probably not going out of my way to handcuff them. One caveat is I will try anything if the value is really good. If I get ETN around pass value and I can get Tuten around pass value, I'm going to pair them together in that situation.
Yeah, I like that answer. I mean, it does make a lot more sense. I mean, do you think that there's any validity to, maybe you're only doing 20 or 30 drafts this summer and as a result, you don't have the breadth of portfolio. And so you would then pair them, in those circumstances. Because you and I have both done so much research on these ambiguous backfields at this point that we know that when they are truly ambiguous in this way, that's where the money's at. Right. And so, would it make more sense then if you're only doing fewer drafts to maybe pair them up more frequently?
I don't think so. I still think you want to make your bet in an individual draft and kind of assume it goes that way. Now, if I'm looking at this situation wrong, and maybe this is kind of a dual role backfield that I mentioned, then maybe there is more legitimacy there.
Yeah.
And I do think whenever you start getting into the backfields where, both guys are beyond round 8, which is the case in Jacksonville, I believe.
Yeah.
The cost isn't too bad. But I think just because you're doing 30 teams, I still think you want to optimize each team, sort of give yourself the best chance within that team. I don't think you want to bring in more hedging because you're doing less teams.
Yeah. Just want to be clear for folks, if they are on the lower side from a volume perspective. Who are your favorite stacks right now over on DraftKings?
So I really like a lot of the mid-tier quarterbacks this year and some teams that are stackable around with them. I think it's pretty deep, and there's you see this all the time. You know this better than anyone with the pocket passers. There's a lot of chasing what happened the previous year in both directions. Last year, CJ Stroud was probably going way too early.
Yep.
This year, I think he's going too late. And on DraftKings, where the rookie receivers are cheaper than on other sites, very stackable for Stroud to get, Higgins and Noel late. Really like Nico at the 1-2 turn. I think even Christian Kirk is a very good best ball player. Sometimes in best ball, we think of, you got to shoot for upside, but kind of these guys that are going to be out there and rack up some volume consistently and give you usable scores. quite frequently. I think Christian Kirk can be that for Houston. And you can even, I'm not a big Dalton Schultz fan, but it's not hard to tack him on very late. So I like the Texans. I like the Jaguars. I like the Dolphins. I think these are three teams with highly drafted quarterbacks that if things break right, it's that case where everyone is going to benefit and pay off ADP. The price tags on Tyreek and Waddle are cheaper than they've been the past few years. If they can stay healthy, it's a big if, but I think there's a ton of upside there. And in Jacksonville, you've got Brian Thomas, just an elite player. You've got Travis Hunter, who's a special prospect, but because of the unique situation he's in, he's not going, nearly. I mean, if he was wide receiver only, this is someone that would be going kind of where we had, Malik Neighbors going last year, somewhere in that range. But so if you're willing to take those risks, and again, quarterbacks that have some sort of pedigree, and you've got a new coaching staff in Jacksonville as well.
Yeah.
Guy who had success with Baker in Tampa. And there's just more uncertainty in those situations. And those are kind of the ones you want to buy in. Like there's uncertainty with the Bears, but everyone's sort of buying into that because it's not flying under the radar. Jacksonville people might not be buying into as much.
Yeah. I love those answers. All right. Let's talk about tight end. You started to chat about that a little bit earlier. Are you in or out on elite tight ends? And what does the data kind of say about them?
So I think I'm in, but the data is a little tricky because there's such a small sample each year. It's like Travis Kelce has a year where he goes nuts and it's like elite tight ends amazing.
Right.
And then we have a year like last year, a couple years where a few of the elite tight ends disappoint and it's like, man, you really should have just taken 3 late tight ends.
Yeah.
So the data's tough to pin down on elite tight end. And I think sometimes the conversation's almost skewed too structurally as a result, where there's kind of people are like, oh, you need an elite tight end because, the positional advantage you can get is greater than the positional advantage you can get elsewhere, especially in the playoff weeks. You get these tight end spike weeks, no one can compete. And there's validity to that, but I think it can be overblown. I think the other side can maybe, look at failure rates and like overly focus on that. So we're kind of just focused on getting like our inputs right on the tight ends and sort of seeing how the value over replacement player works. It's not perfect because there is some playoff specific nuance you might want to apply.
Yeah.
With that said, what we found with the same inputs, on some of the half PPR sites, we find people overvaluing the elite tight ends and really maybe trying to make it more of a thing than it needs to be. Whereas I'm trying to kind of treat Bowers and McBride individually where they should go relative to the other players. And then a full PPR site like DraftKings, we have them undervalued. And I think a lot of their value is like way more volume than these later tight ends. And we talked about this with the PPR scoring, but a cherry pick stat line. But if McBride goes 8 for 100 in a game without scoring on a normal half PPR site, that's 14 fantasy points. Hunter Henry goes 3 for 30 with a touchdown.
Yeah.
He's scoring 10.5 points. Like it's like a 3-point difference. It's not a huge edge. On DraftKings, that gap grows to like 9 points. Because you're getting the bonus, you're getting the full PPR. That's like adding a touchdown to McBride's stat line in terms of the gap between the two players. So I do think that affects the tight ends in a meaningful way. And as a result, we're ahead of ADP on both Bowers and McBride on DraftKings. So I'll say I'm in, but it's not like every year you should be trying to go elite tight end. I think you want to kind of try and base it on the player pool for that specific year.
Yeah, and this is research I did for the draft guide this year, and this is season-long based, obviously, but it does, obviously, I mean, it's not like it's a completely different game. But last year seemed like, especially in hindsight, like a transition year at tight end, where the ADPs were kind of showing us that too, where it wasn't like these guys were going in the first and second round as frequently as we had seen in the past. And so then we see what happened. Like, we knew that someone was going to emerge, right? We knew that it was going to happen, but I think that fewer probably did than expected last year, but we still got Trey McBride, we still got George Kittle, and we still got Brock Bowers, right? And it seems like this year, and if you look at like the predictability of early round tight ends and how, where they're drafted and how they finished, top 3-ish tight ends usually are the guy. And of course, this is in a sample that includes Travis Kelce, Rob Gronkowski, all of that. But even when you remove those guys from the sample, the guys, who are top 3 or so in ADP that aren't them still are giving you like the big outputs at the end of the season. And so I do think, and this kind of goes to it definitely goes to quarterbacks too, in my opinion, where like, we can look at Vorp, and I want to maybe get your thoughts. This will just be sort of like a freestyle about this because I think it's just a really important aspect of fantasy football that doesn't get talked about enough. But like, we look at Vorp and we do this analysis, this value over replacement player analysis, and we're saying, okay, this guy's projected for X number of points more than this guy, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a predictability angle to this that is not really spoken about enough, where we know pretty factually, I should say, but maybe that's too strong of a word, who the top quarterbacks are going to be this year. Like Josh Allen's been a top 2 quarterback in fantasy football for like 6 straight years. Jalen Hurts, we know who that's going to, we know he's going to get it done. Lamar Jackson, obviously, we know he's going to get it done. And now we expect Jaden Daniels to be that dude. I feel that way too at tight end, where we have a better idea about Bowers, McBride, and to a lesser extent, but I think to a decent extent, George Kittle. And that to me should at least be elevating their cost to at least some degree. I don't mean that like we got to draft them around earlier than where they're going, but I do think that's pretty important, like that we feel really good about that player, because once you get into even like Sam Laporta at tight end 4, we're sitting there and we're like, well, look at what happened last year. And it was a very up and down season. And that just happened to be the year that Jameson Williams was more introduced to the offense. And now Ben John, like you start to get all of these factors that are more volatile, and that won't necessarily show up as much in a projection. And so that to me is one of the reasons why I also feel better about going with one of those elite tight ends. Do you think that's the wrong way of thinking about this?
No, I think that makes sense. I do think in that is an element I'd like to build into our analysis a little bit more in the future, is the predictability of positions.
Yeah.
If I was pushing back a little bit, it would just be like injury rates are a little bit higher on the tight end position.
Yeah, fair.
Even though,
Yep.
And then also, while you're right, we're still only filling one tight end position, especially in best ball, where we can potentially just cobble together a different strategy. And there's still an opportunity cost to like, are you taking Brock Bowers or are you taking, Derrick Henry or Drake London?
Right.
Like there's still, even though you're right in terms of the predictability of the position, especially in terms of the finishing order, like on a per game finishing order, the variance between Brock Bowers at the tight end position is way less than the variance of like Drake London at the wide receiver position.
Right.
Brock Bowers is going to be on a per game basis a top 3 tight end.
Right. Like we know that now, basically.
Like that's 100% locked in.
Yeah.
But it's just hard to know the full trickle down effect when you're starting, 3 wide receivers versus 1 tight end. So
100%. Yeah.
But I do agree. I think, if you're getting really nerdy in the future, like there's some stuff that like if you could figure out like a season long sim or something, that'd be like really interesting to like kind of be able to code in the predictability of the different positions a little bit better.
And look, you're preaching to the choir, obviously, because I've been, streaming tight ends on Living the Stream for over a decade now and talked about it being a onesie and supply and demand and all of that kind of stuff. And so, I totally agree. And I think at the end of the day, what I've sort of come to the conclusion of is that in these environments, I'm usually just going early or just not at all, right? I'm really just getting those 3 late round tight ends and feeling better about it, as opposed to like really forcing it with Sam Laporta, really forcing it with TJ Hawkinson, and really forcing it with Travis Kelce, just because historically that's where the predictability has fallen off. And I think that's where even within this, environment, that's where the volatility really begins, is kind of after the George Kittle range.
Historically, the 6th to 8th round world of tight ends has
been horrible.
Has not done well. There's a lot of risk in those profiles. So I agree with that. Yeah. And like I said, we're ahead on Bowers and McBride. So I'm definitely in on it on DraftKings. I'm just not sure about the year over year structural edge necessarily being like, you need an elite tight end.
Yeah. Makes a ton of sense.
Like I think you can win without an elite tight end. Yeah. But if they're good values, then take them and build around your team around that accordingly.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, when we look back, last question, when we look back on the 2025 season, what's one macro trend that you think we're going to see? Last year, macro trend was the RB2s were a lot better, partially or largely because of the lack of injuries and such that we saw. Or, earlier round running back was better than folks thought, entering the season. What's one thing that you think we'll see at a macro level as we look back on the 2025 season? So it's January 2026 as you're answering this question.
I'm going to try and people please here, but late round quarterback, baby.
Ooh, there we go.
Maybe not like too late round, but in best ball, late round is more like mid round. But I just think there's a slew of pocket passers that, maybe just ran a little bit bad last year, and the position just seems deeper than I remember it with Drake May stepping in and being like a viable candidate.
Mm-hmm.
You've even got young guys like Michael Penix, Bryce Young that have some breakout potential. And then on DraftKings, we already hit on the skill players with the PPR scoring and the bonuses maybe being more important to get at the top. So I think like taking 3 mid-round quarterbacks is the way to go. I hit on Stroud, Lawrence, and Tua as my favorite stacks. But you get like Dak Prescott in there, who's added weapons and had a huge season in the past. And like, why is his ADP much lower than before? It's, just all based on recent history. So I really think the mid-round quarterback's the way to go. And this might just be perception, but I feel like the skill players in the first 6 rounds are a bit better than we've had in some previous years. That's definitely just based off feel. I don't have any data to support that. We had a slew of running backs last year, change teams and get in better situations that all hit, and they're still with those teams this year. You've added Ashton Genty to the running back player pool. Chase Brown broke out and is like a type of guy that like we actually like. And, the wide receiver position, we're going to get Rashee Rice back. We had some Xavier Worthy breakout. We have some early rookie receivers and McMillan and Travis Hunter. I just think those first 6 to 7 rounds are pretty deep at skill players. So I really like the 3 quarterback builds this year more than I have in the past.
Yeah. I mean, I love that answer for a lot of reasons. But look, I mean, I've said on the show plenty that I've touted early round quarterbacking over the last handful of years too, because of that predictability angle. But
I was just jumping there, and it's different between best ball too and regular redraft, where I'm, in best ball, I'm getting the benefit. I got like 3 of these guys. I just need one of them to match, Allen, or just be close. And then the stackability of bringing along the teammates. So it's like a pretty big difference there, where I don't think these quarterbacks have top 6 quarterback upside that I'm mentioning. Mm-hmm. But I think they could all be like the Baker Mayfield of this year, which is really good. And you get a bunch of bets on that. If you're more traditional, like casual redraft league, you're going to put more emphasis on like, hey, I can beat my opponents elsewhere. Let me lock in these elite quarterbacks. To your point, the predictability, we know who the top 5 quarterbacks pretty much are going to be, at least, 75% of them.
Yeah. I think that's like the key difference, if you were to just high level this between best ball and season long, is that you have to think about the predictability side. And can you match that with, players automatically going into your lineup with these spiked weeks? And I agree, especially with those extra 2 rounds, just to bring things back to the beginning of the show, especially with those final 2 rounds and those extra 2 rounds, it's easier to get 3 quarterbacks in there. And, if you understand the volatility of passing production and touchdown rates and stuff like that, you can throw together the Trevor Lawrences and the CJ Strouds of the world and Bryce Youngs, who actually has some mobility upside too. You can put them together and match that kind of production. So that makes a ton of sense. Leone, this was great as usual. I'm sure everyone's going to walk away with some more knowledge about best ball. Let everyone know what you're working on, where they can find you, and what you guys have going on over at ETR.
Yeah, you can just head over to establishtherun.com to find all my stuff. Part of the rankings team, we have rankings for a ton of different formats, including DraftKings top 300 specifically for best ball. So make sure to check us out there. Once the season rolls around too, we'll be a great home for you for DFS content and projections.
Yes, absolutely. You can find all my stuff over on lateround.com. Make sure, people, that you are pre-ordering the late round draft guide. That goes out July 1st. That will go up in price on July 1st. So pre-order before then. I got to get that thing done because I only have about a week to go until that thing launches. But check it all out, lateround.com. Make sure you're subscribed. And make sure you check out the YouTube channel as well, youtube.com/@lateroundff. As always, everyone, thanks for tuning in.